Okay, let's dive into a case that really blurred the lines between a dark fantasy and an actual felony. This is a story that completely took over the headlines and forced everyone to ask a really tough question. When does a thought become a crime?
So, first things first, the media gave him a nickname, the Cannibal Cop. I mean, what a shocking title, right? Especially for a New York City police officer. It's a name that perfectly captured the public's horror. But the real question was, did it actually capture the truth? And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was Gilberto Valle some kind of predator hiding in plain sight, carefully planning out real-world crimes? Or was he just a guy who was lost in an extremely disturbing but ultimately harmless fantasy world? The courts had to figure it out, and we're going to break down exactly how they made that call. To really get this case, we have to start with the man himself. Who exactly was Gilberto Valle before the media gave him that infamous nickname? You know, if you just looked at his life on paper, everything seemed completely normal. He was a cop with the NYPD, he had a psychology degree from the University of Maryland, he met his wife on OkCupid, got married, and they just had a baby daughter. Just a regular guy living in Queens, right? But what was happening online? Well, that was a totally different story. A much, much darker one. And it was about to have some very, very real consequences. And wow, did things escalate fast. I mean, look at this. In early 2012, he gets active on this fetish website. By October of that same year, his own wife discovers his chats, she reports him to the police, and bam, the FBI arrests him. Just like that, his career with the NYPD was over. So what was he doing that was so bad? He was having these graphic, super detailed conversations with 24 other people on a site called Dark Fetish Net. And the subject? Well, it was about kidnapping, killing, and cannibalizing over 100 women he knew in real life. We're talking friends, acquaintances, even his own wife. But, and this is a huge piece of the puzzle, this is what his entire defense was built on. In almost all of those chats, 21 out of 24 to be exact, Val explicitly said this was all fake, it was make-believe. He called it a world in my mind, basically trying to draw a clear line between his thoughts and any kind of real-world intent. The federal government, though, they were not buying it, not for a second. They hit him with two incredibly serious charges. First, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, which could mean life in prison. And second, for illegally using a police database to look up information on some of the women he was talking about. So the stage was set for a pretty dramatic courtroom battle, but what happened next? I don't think anyone saw it coming.
All right, so the trial happens. The jury hears all of the graphic, stomach-turning details from these online chats, and they come back with their decision. Guilty. Guilty of the conspiracy and guilty of misusing the database. At that point, it really looked like Valle's fate was sealed.
But then came the twist. In a move that is super rare in the legal world, the judge on the case, Paul Gardefeu, stepped in. He flat out disagreed with the jury. He argued that the prosecution never actually proved this was anything more than just, in his words, fantasy roleplay. He issued something called a judgment of acquittal. This is a pretty big deal. It's when a judge decides that, legally speaking, the evidence just wasn't strong enough to support the jury's guilty verdict, so he essentially overruled them. But even with the judge stepping in, it wasn't like he just walked out of the courtroom a free man. The legal wheels turned slowly. By the time everything was sorted out and he was finally released, Valle had already spent 21 months behind bars. And get this, 7 of those months were in solitary confinement. But the fight was far from over. The government was not happy, and they appealed the judge's decision, trying to get that conviction put back in place. Meanwhile, Valle's lawyers were appealing the one conviction he still had, the one for misusing the police database. So this all went up to the next level, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, for what was basically the final showdown. The government was on one side, trying to reinstate the jury's verdict, and Valle's team was on the other, arguing he should be cleared of everything. And then, in December 2015, the final decision came down. The appeals court sided completely with Valle. They upheld the judge's acquittal on the conspiracy charge, but then they went even further and overturned his conviction for misusing the database. After this long, twisted legal journey, he was a free man, completely cleared of all charges. So you might be wondering, why? Well, for the big conspiracy charge, the court said, Look, the prosecutors never proved a genuine agreement to actually go out and do this stuff. Without a real plan to act, it just stays in the world of fantasy, not criminal conspiracy. And for the other charge, misusing the database, the court used a legal principle called the rule of leniency. All that really means is that if a law is ambiguous or unclear, the court has to lean in favor of the defendant. They basically said the law he was charged under was too vague to make the conviction stick. So what this case leaves us with is this really powerful, kind of unsettling legacy. It sits right at the intersection of technology, free speech, and the law, and it forces a really difficult conversation about where we draw these lines.
And because the whole thing was so strange and disturbing, it's really cemented its place in pop culture. There was an HBO documentary about it, it inspired a Law & Order SVU episode, and Valle himself even co-wrote a memoir about the whole experience.
At the end of the day, the courts gave their answer for Gilberto Valle. But for the rest of us, the question is still out there. In our digital world, where our darkest thoughts can find an audience online, where exactly should the law draw the line between a disturbing fantasy and a criminal act? It's a debate this case forced into the open, and one we are still far from settling.